Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 17th of May, 2020, and excited to do this today. We've got a lot of tough questions. I'm definitely going to need some community help with some of these here. Hope everyone's doing well out there, staying healthy and well. And just if you could give me a thumbs up if the sound is okay here, just double checking our signal chain here to make sure we're good. Again, today we're using the Apollo X6 Universal Audio for the microphone here. And then that is being fed into the Canon C200 camera, which goes into the A10 Mini, goes into the computer, which comes out via Ecamm Live to YouTube. So sounds good. Okay, all right. Then I'm going to take those off for the time being. We'll come back in and check every once in a while. Those are monitors, just for your awareness. That's monitoring fairly early in the signal chain, so not a lot of delay, but it's also not the perfect way to monitor your audio. All right, let's switch over to our agenda and take a look at what we have going for today. First of all, I will have a video up on Tuesday this week. Normally I post on my main channel, I post on Sunday mornings, but we have something a little special this week, and it's specifically, I can tell you very little, but I can tell you this, it is for Soundies. It's probably more in the pro market, but I think even if you're not investing in pro gear, there's some interesting developments there, so you may be interested in watching for that. So that'll be over on the main channel sometime on Tuesday. Second of all, courses. We have, for those that are not aware, we do have a number of courses available over at school.learnlightandsound.com, and we have a new one coming. Hopefully by this time next week, we will have our Zoom F6 course up and available for those of you that are working with the Zoom F6. So got that coming. All right, let's take a look at our questions. We got some good ones, and I want to dive in because we have a lot of them, and there are some really challenging ones here. First up from Greg. Greg, I see you're here. Thanks for your question. You say, or asked, do you calibrate your editing workstation before starting to edit sound? If so, could you go over the process? I don't know that I have a specific process to calibrate each and every time. Of course, there's the initial calibration that goes into setting up a listening space. And, of course, I did some room measurement. We installed we worked with an acoustician, and we got the design worked out and installed some bass traps here in the corners behind us. You can't see, they're off camera, at the first reflection points from the speakers, so directly opposite the speakers. I've got the speakers calibrated in terms of position so that the tweeters are basically at my ear level for the optimal performance there. Got a bunch of other bass traps that you can't see here, but obviously there's that initial setup and some measurements that were done in the process of getting all that set up, but I don't have a specific. In terms of software, I guess there are a few things. If you are going to be mixing in multi-track mode in Adobe Audition, there is a setting. Let me just pull that up here and see what it's called. It has to do with perceived loudness, so you have to get that just right here. And preferences, I think it's under multi-track. Yeah, let me just share the screen here really quickly. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. There is this one default panning mode, and I believe you want the -3 dB center is typically the one thing that I'll do there. Let's see here. But aside from that, there are some other things too for my Universal Audio Apollo X6 interface. There are a couple things there. So I do use plugins from time to time to do some audio processing. So for example, right now we're using the LA2A, which is a limiting compressor. And mainly I just use that for live streams. And so I just come in and double check that is turned off. I don't want that processing the audio that I'm also processing. So, and the way that works is there's a separate console app. So I have to go in there and just double check that we have that turned off. So that is one thing I do each time. Aside from that, I don't have a lot else that I do. When I do, I generally like to turn the headphones down when I'm listening to the monitors and vice versa. So when I switch over to the headphones, I like to turn the monitors off just so I'm not getting any sort of comb filtering or anything like that. But other than that, that's kind of the basic process. So nothing too sophisticated. But I'm interested, if there was something else you were driving at, I'd be very interested to hear what other types of things you'd be looking at as far as calibration. I have plenty of room to learn and improve, so definitely open to that. So thanks for the question, Greg. Next up from Jerry, is it preferable to have a dedicated hardware mixer as opposed to using a software-driven mixer as seen in the ATEM Mini? It occurs to me that it might be challenging to make a real-time adjustment in the ATEM Mini when broadcasting live, especially if you're a one-man show. What features would you consider imperative in a dedicated mixer if this is a sensible consideration? Definitely. I think this is very personal question, so it's going to depend on the person. Some people are perfectly fine using software mixers. I prefer hardware when I can. Just prefer I think it's a little easier to identify a fader and be able to move that versus, moving around with a mouse, trying to find where the mouse pointer is, getting it on the right one, and so on and so forth. Some of the software faders are a little funky in terms of their response. If I want something very smooth, I'd prefer hardware. But I think there are plenty of people that would also say that for them, software is just as easy, and so they don't mind. In fact, a lot of the live sound reinforcement work I've seen done recently, a lot of the mixers are walking around with iPads, and they're connected to the mixer. They're using purely digital mixers and connected with their iPad, and they're using the iPad as their surface for a lot of the work. Now, at least during the setup of the show, I've seen some using it during the show as well. But again, it comes, I think, really down to personal preference. But I'm curious what some of you others think out there too, software versus hardware when it comes to live mixing. So generally, I think my preference is for hardware if it's an option, but there are plenty of others with other perspectives as well and preferences as well. So I think it comes down to you. I do see what you're saying in terms of making real-time adjustments in the software in the ATEM Mini. For example, here, let me just share the screen here really quickly, and we'll come over to the app. If I come over into here, there are a couple things going here. First of all, number one, I have the light right over the monitor, so for me, it's kind of hard to see the screen. So there's a practical issue that I need to sort out there. So there's one reason why I generally don't come in here and change a lot of the settings on a real-time basis during a live stream. But there's also the fact of the UI. But I think again, it's doable depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I think you're going to have to watch for noise that's introduced by the mouse if you're using a mouse, if you're a mouse person versus a touchpad person versus, whatever other kind of controller might be out there. So there are a variety of considerations. I think that, again, for me, mostly hardware. So thanks for that question, Jerry. And again, definitely open to comments in the chat there if you want to express your opinion in terms of your preference. And if it is a software preference, definitely interested in seeing what that's all about. All right, next up from Nick, I saw a plugin that might be useful for me called LevelMatic. Unfortunately, it's only for Mac and I'm on a PC. Can you think of a way to achieve similar results in Adobe Audition with either built-in effects or PC-friendly plugins under $100? Well, I actually took a look, Nick. It looks like they have a Premiere Pro version now too. So if you are using Premiere, then that exact plugin is available. And I believe the company is, let's see here. It's distributed through FX Factory. So you can get the FX Factory LevelMatic Audio Leveler plugin for Premiere Pro. They also have a version for DaVinci Resolve. So if you're using Resolve, that's an option there. And then, of course, they have a version for Final Cut Pro as well. So there are a variety of different options. It's basically a leveler. There are lots of other levelers out there. I don't use it a lot, but sometimes if things are a little funky, there is an isotope leveler that I use a few times, not a whole lot. It's not less than $100 though, so it's not really on the list. If anyone else has experience with specific leveling plugins, please let us know in the chat there. But again, I think, Nick, you can find, if you are using Premiere, there is definitely a version available there for Premiere. So that may be the best of what you're looking for. Now, there is another one. Auphonic has a service. You can either download the desktop app, which I believe is a bit more than $100, but not a lot more, or you can use their online service where you get a certain number of hours free per month based on the amount of audio you're having it process. And the then there's a fee for additional time. So that's another option as well. I know Auphonic does some leveling as well. So those are the ones I'm aware of, and I think it's a fine question. The thing that I find challenging with levelers is that especially if it's multiple input mics that are mixed into the same mix, and so you're trying to fix the mix without having the individual isolated channels, levelers can be a little funky, because if there's a big difference between the two people talking, say their levels, you get this thing where it may level out the perceived loudness of the two people talking, but you're also lifting that noise floor to make that happen for the person that's a lot quieter. And so it can sound a little funky, so you have to be kind of careful with those. So just some thoughts there on leveling. If it's not a big difference, then it's generally not that much of a problem. All right, next up from Olin. I'm using an SM7B into a MixPre 6. What should be an acceptable noise floor? I see a lot of people running an SM7B into a cloud lifter and then a Focusrite or an H6H5 or something, and they're still getting cleaner signal than me. I was under the impression the MixPres could supply enough clean gain. All my something and grounding is good, and cables also. Is minus 60 a good noise floor? I'm assuming you're talking about minus 60 dB full scale. Am I doing something wrong? And is a little bit of static the best I'm going to get with such a low sensitivity mic? The audio is pretty unusable for my situation with that much static. I've switched to mainly using it for live streams as the noise is less noticeable. Any tips? I have condensers, but really prefer the sound of the SM7B for my situation. Thanks. Sorry I can't upload a clip. I will when I'm able soon. Well, I'll look forward to that clip. I think that'll hopefully be telling. I think that you should, in my experience, definitely able to achieve better than a minus 60 dB at full scale noise floor with the Shure SM7B. I don't know if you're doing any other processing with it, or what's going on there, or if you have anything else in the signal chain, but up until just the last 2 weeks, we were using a MixPre to drive the Shure SM7B. So any of these sound for video sessions prior to last week, for the last several months, we've been using a MixPre and a Shure SM7B. So you can go back and listen to those and see what was achieved there to see if that's in line with what you're experiencing. But that doesn't sound, it sounds like something's wrong. And I will look forward to listening to a clip when you get a chance to send that over. You can use, if you want to use something like WeSendIt or one of those free services, that'd be a great way to do it if you need a way to get that over. So, all right. I would also, before we move on, let's talk about grounding. I would simplify your signal chain as much as possible. If you're connected to a camera, disconnect that and do a test. If you're connected to a battery that's shared between multiple devices, disconnect all the other devices. Really isolate it to see where things are coming from. This is how that troubleshooting is always going to happen. Is you're going to have to simplify the signal chain as much as possible and walk through step by step by step. My experience is that when you connect to a camera, there are a significant number of cases where you can pick up some ground loop issues or some static and noise of that nature. So definitely simplify that signal chain as much as possible so you can identify where it is. Here, for example, Bangs, let's just switch back to my main camera here. And Bangs Naughty Bits is also saying here, on a MixPre 6 peaking at minus 12 dB, I've seen minus 87 dB as an ambient noise floor in the dead of night. So, and again, yeah, anything below that. Oh, Plugin Boutique is giving away the Era 4 leveler with purchase. So there's a little, for the question on leveling, which was from Nick. You might want to check that out as well. That's from Acusonus, so they make some pretty decent plugins as well. All right, let's go back to our questions here. If you yourself were doing a live stream with 2 or 3 people, would you use the MixPre or the Roadcaster Pro? And what would be your reasons for one over the other? Okay, you're going to put me on the spot here. This really is a subjective question, and it comes down to personal preference. Here's what I would do and what I have done in the past. I went with the MixPre, in particular the MixPre 10, And the reason I did that is it had balanced outputs that I could feed into the camera. So in that particular case, that's what made sense. And the other reason I did it was two more reasons. Number one, I'm more familiar with the mix pre than I am with the Roadcaster. And number two, the mix pre that I use for live streaming also has the Mix Assist plugin on it. So if I had multiple people, the Mix Assist is a really, really useful feature. Now, what am I giving up? The thing I'm giving up when I go to that is I'm giving up a built-in compressor and limit. Well, I have a limiter, but I don't have a compressor in the mix pre to kind of optimize the loudness for the live stream. But then in that case, I use it in my A10 Mini. So I do have a compressor there where I can kind of compress the peaks down a little bit and you apply some makeup gain and get the perceived loudness where I'd like it. So that's generally my preference. Now the Roadcaster can do a lot of those things. It does not have an auto mix feature, but it does have a noise gate feature. Noise gate's not exactly the same thing. The noise gate will mostly address any sort of room tone in between phrases. So if everyone stops talking for a while, that's what that's addressing. So that's a consideration there. It does have a compressor, and in fact, they have a beta firmware out, which I've been playing with a little bit, where you can tweak all of the individual parameters or settings for the compressor and really kind of dial it in. They also, I noticed in one kind of funny thing is I noticed in the beta firmware that they also have an output compressor, which was on by default, and I didn't realize that, and so I was kind of tearing my hair out. So in any case, I hope that gives some perspective. That would be the way I would approach it with the mix pre. And again, that's going to be very subjective because, again, I'm more familiar with the mix pre than the Roadcaster. But I think that there are plenty of people that would work with the Roadcaster as well. Now, one of the challenges with the Roadcaster that I've seen is that if you're feeding audio out of one of the, they have two line level outputs for monitoring, and I've seen people try to feed those into various consumer level cameras, and they've run into a lot of issues where they're getting some grounding issues again. And maybe that's another thing we need to address in more detail, and we could talk about ferrite cores and isolators and things of that nature. But I did have a conversation via email with someone who was having a lot of trouble getting audio from a Roadcaster Pro into a GH5 without introducing a whole bunch of noise and interference. And I think it sounded to me like a ground issue of some sort. But in any case, he was going to go off and look at isolation options to see if he could make that work. But he was having a lot of challenges with that. The thing that was kind of tripping us up in that case too is that it didn't seem to be a problem when feeding audio to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras, the 4K and the 6K, but it did appear to be a problem with the GH5. And that could just be a difference in implementation at the hardware level. So anyway, that's something to consider if you are going to feed it into the camera for the live stream. You're going to want to do some testing ahead of time to make sure you're not having any issues there. And powering is going to be another thing too. Another person sent me a note this week. They were having some issues where they bought it was actually not an inexpensive power distribution system for cameras, and they were powering their mix pre with that. And every time they powered with that power distribution system, they were picking up a bunch of like ground noise in the mix pre. As soon as they disconnected from that and powered via some other method, it was perfectly fine. So it appeared that particular power distribution system didn't have any sort of filtering on the different outputs. So in any case, those are the kind of things to be concerned with, or to kind of think about when you're considering which of those to use. In my case, the Mix Pre 10 made more sense. Now the Mix Pre 3 with the like the 3 and the 6 without the balanced outputs, those might, that would, again, I would still test. Again, you can pick up ground. And I've noticed the GH5 in particular, but I've also heard this with some of the Sonys as well more recently. It's not difficult to start getting those ground issues when you're connecting the recorder mixer to the camera directly. So definitely something to watch out for. So thank you for that question. All right, next up, could you please talk on the earning money aspect of audio production? And let me pause there before I get into the question. I can speak to it a little bit. I don't do that full time. My full-time job is at a software company doing the corporate video for them, and so and then of course I'm also a product manager there. But I don't have to negotiate rates there. That's already done. It's part of my salary. And then when I do the freelance jobs periodically, that's where I can speak to this a little bit. And I do probably like 4 or 5, 6, maybe 8 of those a year, depending on the year. So just as a background, I'm not a super expert on that, but we do have some other people that are doing this, and perhaps they can chat about that as well. Also, thanks, Vincent. Welcome, and thanks for the super chat. I really appreciate that. All right. So now here's the question. My main activity is now documentary work for Israel TV channels, where I was offered for audio production an amount of about $400 a day in the field. How is it compared to US rates? Well, first of all, Alex, that depends entirely on the market that you're in. And so, for example, if you're in Atlanta or you're in New York or you're in the Los Angeles, Hollywood area, the rates can be very different there versus somewhere where there's not the sound union is not organized. So here in Utah, for example, it's a different market. There isn't as much demand, first of all, during most parts of the year, so the rates are just not quite as high. Now, I can talk about what I have most recently. I have charged. I actually ended up working the most recent job I charged $650 was my day rate, and then I also had a kit charge, and that we're going to talk about that here in a bit. So remember, that's a market where there's not a huge amount of demand. So it's going to be different. I think in Hollywood and other places, it's easy, in the bigger cities where there's a lot more production, the rates are significantly higher. So that's one thing to consider. Strange that they are renting lights and cine cameras and equipment while expecting me to bring my own audio equipment. Is it a common practice in the industry, or should I charge them for the equipment separately? I would definitely be charging for the equipment separately. There should be a rental fee. You have to be able to maintain your equipment. There's the initial purchase of the equipment. There's repairs. There are all the costs that go into that equipment. They are, in part, they're renting your expertise, or they're paying for your expertise, and they're renting your equipment. So you should definitely have a separate rental fee for your kit. And that rental fee should also cover anything that you have to rent for that particular production. So absolutely yes, positively. Okay. They do not care about the audio recorder I use, but are obsessed with DPA microphones. They want me to also record using boom and lav mics at the same time. Okay, so first of all, recording with boom and lav mics at the same time is pretty standard practice. So I see that as totally normal, and they want some redundancy. I think you as a good sound mixer want redundancy, so I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's a good thing. They do not care about the audio recorder I use. That's great. So you have freedom to use whatever makes sense in your particular case. I think that's good. And then as far as DPA microphones, if they are insistent on DPA microphones, that is fantastic, but that should also be reflected in your rental kit, or your rental fee for your kit. If you don't already own DPA microphones and you have to rent them, then that cost all gets passed on to them in the form of your kit rental fee. So absolutely, definitely. Or if you also are going to be working with them on a long-term basis, then that rental fee should also include, from my point of view at least, it should include building up capital so you can purchase those mics so you don't have to rent them every single time. And then you can potentially pass some of that savings on to them. And so anyways, there are some thoughts there in regards to fees for your services. So $400 seems a little bit low. I don't know what the market's like there. And definitely, so for example, my rental kit fee is usually at least $200 if it's a very super, super simple and I have everything I need. But if I have to go out and rent something, or they're wanting to use more wireless, the fee goes up from there. So definitely some things to consider there. So thanks for that question. I think that's a great one. And I think it's something we all need to be thinking about if we're going to do those kind of jobs. All right. Daniel says, I've been putting together very slowly what I like to think of as professional level gear. I know it's not top notch, but it is what I feel will produce high-end results. Never apologize for your gear. Gear is gear, and it's just whatever you have and you can work with. To me, the more important thing is your skills in working with the gear that you have. So you upgraded from a Zoom H5 to the Sound Devices MixPre 6 Mark II. You upgraded from a Rode NTG2 to an NTG3. And again, that's a fantastic set of, a fantastic kit that you're working with now. You can make some great sound with that. Did a stupid move going from the Sennheiser G4 to Deity Connect dual system. Let me just turn this off here. My phone's over here buzzing at me. Okay. So that is my question. In your vast experience, well, first of all, I'm not sure my experience is vast, but what professional lavalier system should I try to get? What could be a couple of good options? I know there will be an important price jump, but I think it's important to always keep improving both your skills and your gear. Okay. All right. Daniel, some good questions there. So wireless is tricky, and there does seem to be a vast gap between the consumer and the pro-end gear. The pro-end gear gets very, very expensive. My audio limited A10 system for 2 channels, which is 2 transmitters plus a receiver, was over $5,000 for just the receiver and the two transmitters. So there's a massive, massive price jump when you start getting into that level of gear. The biggest challenge, I think, is that when you want a dual channel system, that's hard. Now, I believe Sony, I don't have an experience with the Sony wireless kits, but Sony has some stuff that's a little bit more mid-price. So you're going to be talking about probably $1,000 for a dual channel receiver, plus another, I'm going to guess, $600 or $800 for the transmitters. I'm not positive on that. That's one thing to look into. Sony may be a good one to look at. The challenge I've always had with Sony that kind of drives me crazy is at least, I don't know if this is still true, but for a long time they were using a different type of input. And I realize just about every wireless system does, but they were using a 3.5 millimeter TRS input that was wired differently than everybody else. And it was not the kind of thing that you could buy. Well, maybe you could buy Sony lavalier microphones off the shelf with the correct connector, but pretty much everything else had to be custom terminated with the right connector, was my impression. I don't know if that's right. Maybe someone with more Sony wireless experience can say something in the chat here about that, if you have experience with that. But that's one thing to look at. But yeah, it sounds like you need 2 channels at least. And that's the challenge. Now, I think a G4 can be perfectly fine. I actually think they're good to have on hand. And our friend Greg Palmer a couple of years ago came onto the Sound for Video session and talked about how you could repurpose those as camera hops in the future if you need to when you do upgrade your wireless system to something else. So you do have some options there. So I don't think the G4 is a horrible choice. Deity Connect I like, but I think it's really... There's some downsides to it. You didn't really elucidate what the particular issues you are having with it. I didn't love the microphone that came with it, and the system itself had a bit more self-noise in it than I liked, but it seemed like with the new plug-on transmitter, they made some improvements there, and I think with some of the firmware updates, they've made some improvements as well. So it's really a matter of dialing in the input gain and the output level on those two. It seemed very sensitive to what those settings were as to the overall signal that ended up at the recorder. So I'm not sure what other issues you ran into there, but it's one of the more professional 2.4 gigahertz systems I've used in terms of all the settings that are available to you, so the configurability and flexibility, but it's still 2.4 gigahertz. It had, you had the ability to change the latency. So if you were willing to take a larger latency, you could potentially avoid dropouts. It goes up to 100 milliwatt transmission power, which was impressive. You could control the transmitters from the receiver. All these great features. I just didn't love the sound, even when I connected the third-party mics to it. And maybe that'll change once I get hold of the new Deity lavalier mics. But it was still a little bit noisy. I felt like I would obviously be getting much better. Well, not obviously. I felt like I was getting much better results with the audio limited A10, and so that's it's not a fair comparison by any means. We're talking about a $700 system that includes everything, including the lavalier mics, versus a $5,000 system that doesn't include the lavalier mics. And then, of course, you're going to buy, if you're working with an A10, you're probably going to buy the $300 plus lavalier microphones to work with it. So, in any case, there are some thoughts. I think it's perfectly fine to work with a couple of G4s in the meantime. I'm not a big advocate of, I know some people have a different perspective, and that's okay. My perspective is generally shouldn't go into debt to buy new gear, generally. So I would, if it's a matter of budget, which I assume it is because it is for most of us, I would be okay going with Sennheiser G4s, a couple of those, and renting when I needed to rent beyond that. And then and again, you should be, if you're charging for your stuff, you're either saving up if you're doing self-funded stuff or for the future, or if you are getting paid, you should be renting your kit and socking away a little bit of money there so you can upgrade at some point in the future. So some thoughts there for you, Daniel. Thank you. Next up from Christian. How do I have to position the boom mics to not pick up the other person when I have to expect quite a bit of reverb and echo due to the room? Or should I just go for the lavalier mics? Would acoustic treatment work in any way? So yes, definitely a couple of thoughts here, Christian. Number one, I almost always use booms and lavs at the same time, so we have that option in post. And usually in a super reverberant room, I actually find that there's a good number of times when the lavalier will end up sounding better. So that's another reason to go with both mics at the same time. Mic position is a big and very important thing when you're in that kind of space doing an interview, where there are two people or a dialogue scene or whatever it happens to be. If you can have them, now this is harder in narrative because there's blocking, and so you can't always determine exactly where people are going to stand. But if it's a sit-down interview or something like that for a corporate piece, a commercial piece, something that just fits that format, then moving people farther away will always help that situation. You'll get less mic bleed from one person to the other the farther away they are. Now, they don't have to be way far away, but they do need to not be sitting right next to each other. So that's one thing. As far as aiming the mic, you just have to aim the mic to, use the polar pattern of the mic to help avoid bleed in as much as possible. It's not 100%. You will always get some bleed, but use the null points on that polar pattern and point that at the other person as much as possible so that you're not picking up the other person. And I think you're probably going to get some of the people in the chat here will probably say similar things to that. There's also the 3-to-1 rule. So if you can get the people to be, if you can get the people 3 times farther away from each other than each of the people are away from their mic, that will help tremendously as far as mic bleed is concerned. Rob, thanks so much for the super chat, and thanks for joining us today. So that's another thing. That's a 3-to-1 rule. So if you can get the people sitting 3 times farther apart from each other than the mic is to the person, that helps a lot as well. And that's where obviously lavalier microphones help as well. The nice thing about lavalier microphones in reverberant rooms is that the person's body basically shields, at least from some directions, about 180 degrees. So that helps quite a bit. And it's, of course, right on top of them. So I actually do find that lavalier microphones in those circumstances where you've just got a really messy acoustical environment can help a lot. So there are some things. Acoustic treatment, yes, sound blankets are something I always bring to my jobs, and they can make a huge difference. And they don't have to be everywhere. You don't have to think of sound blankets as I have to cover everything. Just some of them to break up the sound and to absorb a little bit of the sound helps. And so I will usually bring at least 2 along with some C-stands to hang them on, because of course you can't necessarily cover walls and stuff like that, but you can put them on C-stands, and actually you don't necessarily want to go to the walls. You want to, a lot of times I put them right just outside the frame of the camera, so they're in a little bit closer and providing the protection there. You can put them on floors. If you're working on hard surfaces, that can help a lot as well. So lots of different choices there. All right. Thanks for that one. Next up, Luigi, can you please cover more in depth the output chain from the computer to the speakers? While I see the input chain or the headphone speakers well covered in many sites, not so much is available there. There are many options, for example, a USB interface to speakers' headphones, analog output to active speakers' headphones amplifier, or digital, SPDIF output to interface, and so on. What would you recommend, and which are pros and cons of the various solutions? Well, Luigi, I keep mine very simple. So mine is, when I'm in my mix suite here, I use the Universal Audio interface, which is a Thunderbolt 3 interface. And The speakers there's some line outs on the back, and those run directly into the powered monitors. I'm using these focals, and I also have headphones connected, and we're just going to check in on that actually. It seems like we're still sounding okay. And so that's all I use, and those are analog outputs to the focals. It's an analog, obviously, headphone input or output to the headphones, and that's all I do. Now, when it comes to other things like using SPDIF these days, usually means you have a more complex setup of some sort. I don't have a lot of experience with those, but that's a digital interconnect, and that's usually if you have a bunch of other gear that you're connecting to each other. So generally today, with all of the audio interfaces that are available out there, I generally don't use, I have never in my signal chain used any of that. So the nice thing about the digital interconnect is that you're not really likely to pick up a bunch of interference or noise or issues like that. On the other hand, anytime you're moving digital audio around, there is some latency involved, so you'll have to keep an eye on that. But with SPDIF, don't think it's generally a big problem. Unless you're doing some sort of installation type work, but in just a little mixing desk type of setup, it's generally not something you'll use and is not generally a problem. So those are some of my thoughts on that. Let me see if we've covered everything. Using analog outputs, I would assume you mean like directly to active speakers. So that's what we're doing in my particular case. I'm using an analog line level output to powered monitors, active speakers, if you will. Now you can come out directly from your computer into speakers that are made for taking a consumer line level, or actually they're taking a headphone level out. And there actually is a decent set of those that I use. The JBL 1, I think it's the 1 series, and the model is the 104, and they updated them recently and made them Bluetooth, and the Bluetooth is bad. I wouldn't use the Bluetooth. It's not bad because Bluetooth is bad, and it's. I'm not criticizing Bluetooth except for the fact that it introduces too much latency, and you need to not have latency. So I would say that using wireless speakers is going to be a problem if you're doing sound for film, because it will always introduce some latency. So I would always do a wired connection instead to avoid that latency. So those are some thoughts. I don't know, Luigi, if there's some other things beyond that, but SPDIF generally, I mean, I guess, yeah, you'd be using some sort of interconnect to get to that point. So, all right, let's move on here to our next question. Jason, I've got a couple of things here. A few weeks ago, I was able to retrieve my external monitor from the office, which is great, except I started hearing a low-level scratchy interference out of my speakers. The setup is a Mo2 M4 interface with a couple of KRK Rocket 5 monitors and a pair of AKG K240 phones, all exactly the same as at the office where there was no issue at all. Well, almost. It had a high-frequency switching kind of sound, and after going through the signal chain, found it was, sure enough, coming from the monitor's power supply, plugged into the same power strips as the monitors. Headphones were always clear. So just moving the power plug of the monitor to a second daisy-chained power strip made the problem go away. So, long explanation aside, is this something that looping power cords through a choke or a ferrite bead would take care of? I don't have any, but just wondering because I don't really like having daisy-chained power strips. I thought that troubleshooting various interfaces is a great beginner topic discussion as well. Okay. Excuse me. Jason, good question. Yes, this is a theme today. I do have just a little bit of experience with the ferrite cores around interconnect cables and power cables. My Canon C200 came with, and this is, I think, a sign too of a more professional type of piece of gear, is the power cables that it came with have the ferrite cores on it. For those that are not familiar with them, let me see if I can find one here. I do have one. Just one second. Okay, in this case, and I'm going to switch back to the main camera here. So this is a USB cable, and you can see this is the ferrite core, or some people call it, Jason referred to it as a ferrite bead. and it actually has it on both ends. The reason I actually ended up investing in this, I use this with my Allen & Heath SQ5 digital mixer when I connect it to my computer. When I first got it and I connected it with just a USB cable I had that didn't have these, I was getting all sorts of noise. And so I went out and bought this cable, problem solved. So that just does some isolation. Another thing too is you could, actually we just got a really good comment here, a really helpful one, LPC. Jason could use a DI box. So that's another thing you could do. So you could essentially, well, let's go back and look at your particular setup here. Your audio interface. So from the Motu M4, you're probably using a balanced connection between those and the KRK rockets, if I had to guess. If you're not, then that's where you probably would want to switch to that, but I'm 99% sure that you are. Yeah, so this is not terribly unusual. This happens, this kind of grounding, stuff. As soon as you have multiple devices connected to each other and they're each powered in some way, there's a risk of this. And so I found a lot of times using separate power supplies solves the problem. So yes, potentially, Jason, I have no way of knowing for sure, but I think that yes, there is a potential that ferrite could potentially help in that situation. Love to see what others have to say as well. And I agree with, I definitely agree with LPC. If you're not using a balanced connection already between your monitors and your interface, that would definitely be something to do. Bangs also says, my Furman power conditioner has 2 separate AC circuits. I do have a Furman here as part of my rack unit as well, and that has just eliminated a lot of problems as well. So, and in fact, interesting here. Okay, Greg's talking. I thought Greg was responding specifically to this this particular question, but in any case, so there are some thoughts there, Jason. It's a good question, and it's definitely a challenge. So ferrite can potentially help. There are also line isolators that use transformers. So I do have what's called an ice cube. I think it's Whirlwind who makes that one. But it is something you can insert into a balanced line if you need to provide some additional isolation as well. So there are a lot of different things. It looks like that's a topic that we probably should cover in more detail. So, all right. Then Jason goes on to say, second is more of a comment, since I missed the last stream on Monday, where someone was talking about how to handle audience audio in a meeting situation. I just wanted to relate that when I was working sound for a nonprofit doing meetups, anywhere from 20 to 100 people in a large rectangular room, we found it worked really well to have a dynamic mic on a stand using our second wireless channel, maybe halfway back in the room on a side aisle. We would just have people queue up for the Q&A section. Since it was more to the back, people were not embarrassed and could easily view them and control the fader as needed. Otherwise, it was having someone going around the audience with the mic, but that was a little bit sloppy and was harder to control, risking feedback, etc., if they were seated near the speakers. So good input there as well, Jason. Thanks for sharing that. And I think that's a good point and a good solution in a lot of cases. Next up, we have a tip from our friend Klaus. A little tip for those to share with everybody on today's live if you can find the time for it. I've been looking for some sort of storage and protection for my microphone, and now I found a cheap and easy way. I know that some microphones come with a case, but that often take up a lot of space if you only have a small bag. Lens protection pouches. I got them from AliExpress, but I think you can buy them anywhere. They come in all shapes and sizes and qualities, but often they don't cost a lot. I have them for 3 of my microphones, and they protect from scratches, dust, and bumps. And then, of course, here's a little picture. I think that's the Rode Pod mic he has there. And a picture. It looks like a neoprene pouch. But that's a great idea. Thanks for sharing that, Klaus. Not something I thought of. And in fact, I do that is something I struggle with sometimes. I know some of the boxes for some of the microphones can get quite large. In fact, there's good reason for it in some cases, but if I have to keep things really light, how do I transport my shotgun microphone? And this is a tiny shotgun microphone. As soon as you move up to some of the bigger ones, the boxes get bigger too. So, all right. Thanks for that, Klaus. Thomas. Issue with the Deity Connect latency lag actually is twofold. A, you're right that any mic going hardwire into the mix pre could be dialed back by 19 milliseconds or 30 milliseconds on the mix pre, depending on what oversampling you have dialed into the Deity Connect system. Just a quick note here for those, just to make sure everyone is up to speed on this. What we're talking about here, the Deity Connect wireless microphone system is a digital system, and it has some latency in it. And in fact, the default settings, it's 19 milliseconds delayed from if you were just connected with a microphone directly to your recorder, and you had the Deity Connect wireless mic system connected to that same recorder, the audio from the wireless system would come in 19 milliseconds later than the wired microphone. So that's the context here. You can also change the settings on the Deity Connect to make the latency even longer to help improve connectivity. So he says, okay, yes, you can, in the mix pre, you can apply a delay on the wireless microphone channels so that they, a delay on the wired microphone channels so that they come in at the same time as the wireless mics. All right, so he says you can do that. The sound device's Wave app does not appear to be a likely fix. App is way dated and will not run on Catalina, for example. All this leads me to consider abandoning the Deity Connect and going to a Sennheiser G4, which I wanted to avoid both for cost and because I prefer the Deity system. This then leads me to ask, what's your take on the MK2 lavs that come with the G4 system? How do you reckon they compare with the Shure TL47 and or DPA discrete 6160 lavs, and how well do the MKE2 lavs match up with various boom options? For example, the Deity S-Mic 2, S-Mic 2S, MKH416, NTG5, or DPA 4017B. All right. So first of all, just a little clarification, Thomas. I think when you say the MK2, those are the MK2, excuse me. I think they come with the ME2 twos. Maybe you can buy an upgraded kit that comes with the MKE2. So first of all, there's a difference between those two. I have tested the MKE2 and I've tested the ME2 2. The ME2 I tested when I reviewed the Sennheiser XWPD or whatever their consumer grade wireless digital system is called. And it's a significant step up from the original ME2s. So I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to or the MKE2s. The MKE2s are rather bright, but I think they're really made for burying under clothing, and once you do that, they generally sound quite good. I really like the MKE2s. The MKE2s cut very well with Sennheiser mics, of course, but I think they also cut reasonably well with a lot of the others. All of the mics that you listed there, I think they're probably going to fit best with the 416. In terms of the comparison, again, if we're talking about the MKE2, the TL47s are not quite as bright in my experience. They still have plenty of, they're still plenty crisp, but the MKE2s seem particularly so. I haven't used the discrete 6160. I've used the 4160. I have one of those on hand, and the DPA has a very unique sound to me. The DPA mics cut very nicely. They're made to cut. Generally, when you buy into a system on a pro level like that, the DPA lavs should cut pretty well with the DPA boom mics. And I do think that the 4160, I think, does cut pretty nicely with the 4017. But I think that amongst all of those, you can make them work in there'll be some work in post and some EQ, of course, but I don't think any of them are a horrible fit. So again, I guess the only distinction I want to make is between the ME2 and the MKE2. If you're looking at the MKE2, I think that's a good choice, and I think it'll cut nicely with most of those booms. I'd be curious to know which of those booms, are you working with one of those already, or are you still kind of trying to figure out which of those to purchase? So anyway, okay, another note here, one thing that Greg mentioned is that he is running Sound Devices Wave Agent on Catalina, no issues, it is dated, but it does run. And there is another caveat, it won't play back 32-bit float audio correctly, but it will still process the files as I understand it. So that is to say, you can add metadata or change the metadata and then resave the file in 32-bit float format, and it will still be 32-bit float and it will work. So just have some thoughts there. So So Thomas, I hope that helps a little bit there on your question. Okay, I think we do have some more. We've got more questions. How are we doing on time? We're coming up on the top of the hour here. Next up from Hildo, I was watching your video about the Zoom L8, and I was wondering how it would compare sound-wise and workflow-wise to my Zoom F8 with the F controller. I understand that the L8 is made mainly for podcaster, but as you were saying, it can be used as a recorder and as an audio interface as well. I do also already have a Roadcaster, but for live event, I like the flexibility to work on battery that the L8 and the Zoom F8 is offering. One note on that in regards to batteries, Hildo, is that I'm not sure what I can and can't say, but what I will say is that some time ago, a couple months ago, Rode had a special kit that they were shipping with the Roadcaster Pro that allowed you to battery power the Roadcaster. And I would be horribly surprised if they don't offer that to everybody relatively soon. So that's what I guess I can say. So that's one factor to consider when you're asking this question here and as part of your consideration. In your opinion, is it worth buying it for a live event? We're talking again about the Zoom L8, which is a very small sort of mixer recorder that is kind of in the form factor of a small mixing board. And it's really made for podcasters. It has some sound pads that you can push to play pre-recorded sounds, so on and so forth. The only thing I would say, the real downside of the Zoom L8 from my point of view is that it was the build quality didn't feel great. That's the only thing that I didn't love about it. Otherwise, it was a really functionally, I think, a really impressive little device. I guess the other thing is that its preamps weren't super strong. I mean, they didn't have a ton of gain. So if you are going to be using a lot of dynamic microphones in the live events, that's something to consider. You'll want to be careful about that because you'll be pushing the gain to the max or very close to the max. The preamps seemed good, but they didn't have a ton of gain. I think I can't remember where they topped out at maybe 58, maybe it was 60. I don't remember exactly, but I did connect the Shure SM7B up to it. And if I were doing a live event in that case, I wasn't going to, I was doing it for either live streaming or sound reinforcement, then it really didn't seem like enough gain, at least for this mic. So that is one thing to consider. Or I guess you're offering the alternative, am I better off with the Zoom F8 kit? Well, the nice thing about the Zoom F8 that it has that the L8 doesn't have is, number one, much cleaner preamps with a lot more gain. It has limiters. It has an auto mix feature, and I think those could be really, really helpful in a live event. So if you've got a Zoom F8 and an F control, I would probably just use that personally. But if you've got the money and the budget and you want a Zoom L8, you can go with that. There's some limitations there, though, so hopefully that helps a little bit. I like to record myself playing music as well, but I have a mix pre too that I can use for that purpose. But maybe the L8 would make music recording easier. I think it is probably better suited for music than the others, and I do believe it does overdub recording. I'll have to double check that. I don't remember for sure. I don't remember. That's something to consider as well. You can actually get the manual, so if you go to the Zoom website, you can download the manual and see. But I know some of the other Zoom products, not the F series, but the others that were originally made for music purposes, do have the ability to do overdub recording. So if you're doing that, or if you're just doing live music, I guess it doesn't matter. You don't need overdub for that. But anyway, there's some thoughts there, Hildo. Hope that helps a little bit. All right. Let's see here. We do have one last question from Zach. So let's switch over to the question from Zach here. Could you confirm that you also have a slight delay when speaking into the mic when using the A10 Mini Pro? I run my mic into my Zoom H6 into my Canon XA11 camera into the A10 Mini Pro and always have a slight delay. Let's do a test here. I didn't have an opportunity to test this ahead of time, Zach. I apologize. I will do this afterwards, but for now, let's just do a clap test here and let's see if anyone notices a delay. So again, my signal chain here, well, there could be a delay here because I'm doing a little bit of processing. So again, my signal chain is the Shure SM7B into the Apollo X6 audio interface, which has a digital signal processor. It's applying some compression, so there could be some latency there. It will be subframe though, it won't be that long. I would guess maybe 13 milliseconds max, probably maybe even less. Then that goes out line level into the camera. The camera comes into the A10 Mini Pro, and that goes to eCam. So everything that gets into the camera should be in sync. So unless there's latency prior to that in the signal chain. So let's do a clap test. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit. I haven't noticed a lot of delay, but hopefully that helps a little bit there. Number 2, could you please run down your Skype settings? When incorporating Skype into the A10 Mini Pro, your conversation with Bandrew Scott a few weeks back was very well done, and the multi-participant production with Alan Williams, Mike Delgadio, and Bandrew Scott was even more impressive. Okay, yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So the one with Bandrew was a little bit different because what we did is we basically recorded that as a double ender. So the audio was all recorded on our own side, independent of the Skype call. And then the Skype call, I used a little app from the same company that makes eCam Live called eCam Skype Recorder, I believe. Or maybe it's just Skype Recorder. I don't remember. But they have a Skype recording app. I used that to record the video from the Skype call. And that ended up working out pretty well. And then, of course, I edited all that in post. So that was the setup we used there. I didn't love that approach because the problem with it is I don't know what the frame rate is that Skype supports, but it was really choppy and weird. And I think what was happening is that somewhere in the chain there, it was doing some sort of frame rate conversion, which it did badly. And if you watch that video closely, what happens is, especially on my end, things look really choppy. And I think it was because I didn't think about this ahead of time, but I had my camera streaming to Skype at 23.976, and I'm pretty sure Bandrew was at 29.97. And I think then from there, Skype also does some of its own bad magic to kind of get everything on the same page. And so that's where that ended up getting kind of weird. So the difference is that when we did the 4-person production with Alan Williams, Mike Delgadio, and Bandrew, we used an online service called StreamYard. So everyone streamed into StreamYard. In that case, I did look ahead and I did change my frame rate to 29.97 because that's what most of those services are expecting. In fact, I think actually even today, like if I move my hand here, I bet you on your side you're seeing some funky stuff as you watch it live. Because I have a hypothesis that YouTube is expecting, I don't know if expecting is the right word. It is assuming that you're going to send it 29.97 frame rate video for the live stream. And then it's geared to present everything to the live stream audience in 29.97. And then what it does is as you stream it and it's capturing all of that, I think it then, because there's a period of time after this live stream ends until it becomes available for other people to watch, that it's reprocessing that. And then when I watch the playback later on, after it's done the processing, it seems like it's corrected the frame rate issue. So you'll see some choppiness here if I move my hand like that in the live stream. But I bet you if you go back to the replay, that it won't be quite so choppy because it'll be displaying it in 23.976. And instead you'll see the motion blur. This is all hypothesis at this point, but in any case, those are the things that I do there. So in the case of the StreamYard 4-person video that we did, that was the one thing I changed, just changed all my cameras. And actually, I think I only used the main camera for that one to 29.97. And it seems like most of the streaming, well, at least YouTube and I think Facebook probably are expecting 29.97, just a common video format. But usually when I produce my videos, I do them at 23.976. And right now we're at 23.976. And yet I think YouTube is converting that to 29.97 to stream it. So anyway, some thoughts there. So thanks, Zach, for those questions. And that is everything that we had that was submitted ahead of time. So let's take a look back here and see how things are going in our live chat here. We did get a thumbs down at the start. I do have a few enemies out there. We talked about this a little bit last week. I'm in a much better state of mind this week. There are some people that hate me, and I can't do a lot to change that. I'm not going to try and be a person that I'm not. I'm also going to continue to produce content, and even though I don't know everything, I think that hopefully in this community we can all learn together. So there are some people that are angry at me because they don't think I know what I'm talking about, and I shouldn't be talking, they think, is what they seem to convey in their comments. So I'm going to guess that the thumbs down is from someone like that, and that's fine. It's more engagement, so we'll take it. Happy Sunday to everybody here. We have Peter coming in from New Zealand. Thanks for joining us, Peter. All right, Kevin, the basic filmmaker, is here. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. Sound is good. All right, and here's Alex. Shalom, friends. Thanks for joining us today. It must be very late. Is it late for you or very early? I guess it's probably very early. All right. Symbian asks, how do you set up Rode Mic Pro with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K and the A10 Mini Pro? Appreciate your advice. Also looking into the Octava MK012. What I would probably do, Symbian, is I would probably, as a start, I would try to feed the mic into the camera, because if you try to feed it directly into the A10 Mini Pro, then you're going to have to adjust for sync issues later on in the signal chain. But that would be my first choice, is I'd probably send it into the camera. So I would just use the 3.5 millimeter and go into the 3.5 millimeter input on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, adjust your input gain. I would try to go with a relatively low gain on the cam. Well, I would set it to 0 on the Video Mic Pro Plus, and then I would adjust the input gain on the camera from there. So, and then you just feed HDMI out of the camera into the A10 Mini Pro. That would be my first approach. Now, if you're going to use the Octava MK02, I would do the same thing, except I'd go into the XLR input on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. So, good question. Thanks for that. And hopefully that works out well for you. Mark is here. Welcome, Mark. It's good to have you here. Let's see. I am D.A. Brown. Audio possibilities for a Memorial Day or Father's Day sale for courses. Oh, well. I hadn't considered that. I do. For the Zoom F6 course, let's say yes. If you're signed up at the school, there will be a discount for the Zoom F6 course for sure. Lloyd, thanks for joining. Good to have you here with us today. Let's see. Okay, Greg is going to talk a little bit about the calibrated station. I'd heard engineers talk about a minus 20 dB white noise playing at 85 dB SPL at the listening station. Okay, now I follow what you're saying, and thanks for the clarification on that, Greg. That is a good idea. I think I'm curious about that because my understanding of that was always to help protect your... Here's the thing that happens in the music studios a lot, or in music studios. And actually, if anyone could speak to this, it's Lloyd, who's worked on some big records and spent a lot of time in studios in the past. But my sense is that with the time I've spent there, the challenge is that a lot of times the volume just ends up getting cranked and cranked and cranked until they're pushing some really significant sound pressure levels. And even 85, to be honest, is a little on the hot end. If you're going to be working for a lot of hours, 85 dB SPL is pretty loud. And I think even the OSHA standard in the United States is for 8 hours, if the average dB SPL is greater than 78 or 79, then the company needs to provide hearing protection for their employees. So 85 seems a little hot to me, and I generally have not had an issue with mixing at hot levels. In fact, every time I've measured it, which I have done a few times, I was squarely in the mid 70s and my playback sound pressure levels. So, and then same thing with headphones. I don't thrive. In fact, it usually just really grates on me if I'm listening to something too loud. So, but that's a good point there. I think it is definitely important to be careful about your monitoring levels. And if you have never measured, even if you just get an app for your phone, and I realize that this is not a perfect way to measure, but there are some that you can at least get you in the ballpark, and measure what the sound pressure levels, the dB SPL, is at your listening position, just so you have a sense for where you're at. And you could find that you are probably pushing higher sound pressure levels than you intended, and you could be potentially damaging your hearing. And hearing is something that there's not a lot you can do to fix damaged hearing. And in fact, there's not a lot. So be very careful. So that is something I haven't done, Greg, and I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Archie, thanks for joining us. Hope everything is good there in Hawaii. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's where you're at. Got a comment there. Minus 20 dB white noise at 85 dPL seems pretty loud to me at my desk, and I agree. Yeah, I didn't even see that comment before, so we're definitely in agreement there, Greg. That seems too loud to me. I think that, that could be that for film mixing, I wonder if there's some sort of standard or maybe maybe it's not even a standard, but a common practice at theaters where they play back at that level. That could be. And that would be interesting, because I have to say that when I've been to some theaters, there are some theaters where the sound is fine, and there are some where it just seems darned loud to me, like too loud. In fact, I measured at some, and I think there was one where we were hitting, I don't know what the average was, but the sound pressure levels were hitting into the low 90s, and to me, that was way too loud. And in fact, the common thing I do is that when I go to when I go to the movies now, I do take a set of Heroes with me. If you haven't heard of Heroes before, there are little earplugs you can use, and they're supposed to be a little bit more transparent than just sticking foam in your ears. In other words, they attenuate more evenly than foam does, where foam will just get all the high frequency and not as much of the low frequency. I don't know how effective they really are, but if I do find myself in a situation where I'm in the theater and it's too loud, I can stick those in at least. I lose out on some of the experience, but there's nothing I can do to change the volume there, so I at least want to protect my hearing. So some thoughts there. Bangs Naughty Bits, do you have any thoughts on what an amateur starting podcaster or work from home type should look for in a basic desk-bound starter mic for a single person? Well, in terms of the microphones I've tested, actually, before even talking about a microphone, the biggest thing I've seen in a lot of, as I've had to work from home for my day job over these last few months, the biggest thing that I find is that people don't wear headphones when they're on conference calls, and they should be wearing headphones. Instead, they're playing back the other end of the conference call, and they're not muting themselves, and they're not using headphones. And that just wreaks havoc. And I know that most of the services have their echo cancellation, so it will generally take care of that to some extent, but it's never perfect, and it wreaks havoc. So if I could only give one piece of advice to somebody in that situation, that is, I would say wear your headphones, and everyone that's on a meeting should be wearing headphones or muted. If you're not going to be contributing to the conversation, it's fine to just mute it and listen to it through speakers. But if there's any chance that you're going to be off mute and not wearing headphones, I think you really owe it to everyone else in the meeting to wear headphones. So there's a thought there. I got kind of off track, so sorry about that, Bangs. In terms of starting microphones, I actually found the Rode, what was it, the NT USB Mini was pretty good. It sounded, let me go take a step back. My very first USB microphone was the Blue Snowball. And I can say this, the USB microphones have come a long way. So the NT USB Mini actually had a pretty decent sound to it. You have to be a little bit careful. It does still record plosives, even though it has an inbuilt pop filter. So you're going to have to be, maybe a few inches off of it, or just at an angle off to the side of your mouth, so you don't get those plosives. But otherwise, that one's been pretty good. And my wife has been using that one I reviewed, and actually my daughter has one too. They sent two of them. And as soon as they arrived, they're like, "Can we have those when you're done?" And they've been using them for their music lessons. And they've been working really well for that. At first, my wife wasn't wearing headphones, and I said, no, honey, you got it. You have to wear headphones for the person on the other side so that when they're talking themselves, you don't get all that funky echo cancellation and artifacting and stuff. But once you started doing that, they've had a really good experience with that. So that's one thing I will say, though, they need to get a desk stand to get it up off the desk and a little bit closer to them. So either a desk stand or a separate mic stand to help optimize its position. So those are some of my thoughts there on that. I think iPad app is okay for mixing, though my experience is purely analog mixers for point and not so good for point and click. Okay, yeah, that's a totally valid perspective, and I definitely understand that. For live outdoor production, can a lavalier be shielded from the wind and obscured from camera, concealed in a flower, in lieu of bigger, obvious-looking dead cat? Actually, Archie, usually I hide it under clothing, and that works really well for preventing wind from creating all of that, the distortion, the wind distortion as the wind moves across the mic capsule. So the clothing usually will take care of that. You could hide it in a flower as well. You could hide it in a hat. You could hide it anywhere you can hide it. Definitely try it out. If you one of the things that's good about a pandemic is that you can try experiments and do things that you've never had time to do. And I think one valid exercise, or one really worthwhile exercise, is to get out a lavalier microphone and work with a friend or family or whomever and try hiding it in all the different places and doing recordings and figuring out what works best, using different mounting techniques, going outdoors. So yeah, definitely try hiding it in different places, Archie. I think a flower is a creative one, definitely worth a try. So good question and good idea, actually. Semyon, I'm planning on using the Octava MK02 for voiceover on Zoom calls using the A10 Mini Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. The Rode mic is generating self noise if connected through the A10 mic in. Your thoughts? So that may be another one of these situations here. You may have to go, let's see, I think the Rode Video Mic Pro Plus does have a removable 3.5 millimeter cable, so you'll either want to, if you want to continue using that directly into the A10 Mini and not route it through the camera for whatever reason, then what you could do potentially is get a cable with a ferrite core on it. And I would put that, if maybe you want to put it on both ends of the cable. I know, for example, here on this USB cable, they have a core on both ends. This is a bidirectional cable, of course, so I'm trying to remember from an electronics point of view, and maybe somebody can leave a note here, which end of the cable is it most important to put it on if it's one directional. So it's an analog audio signal going from one end to the other. I think it's on the receiving end is where you'd want to put it, but I'm not positive on that. So if somebody happens to know, somebody knows a bit more about electronics there, that would be really helpful. But if you can, I would run it directly into the camera and see if that solves the problem. All right. Banks had mentioned that the leveling plugin is available. So that's a really worthwhile thing. So they're doing a fundraiser for the World Health Organization. And they also have a de-esser from Era 4. And then Plugin Boutique is giving away the Era 4 leveler with a purchase of other things. So, and here's a good point that Bangs brings up. When we were talking about the Mix Pre and the Shure SM7B, noise floor below ambient is fine. So there's an ambient noise floor. Every room has a noise floor. Like I'm hearing something in my room right now. If the self noise of the equipment you're using to record is below that, then you generally don't have to worry about it. So that's the biggest thing is the self noise of the system making more noise than the ambient sound? And it sounds like if you're sitting at -60, my guess is probably yes. Well, maybe yes, depending on the situation, but if you've got things pretty well controlled. And then here, Bangs was talking about hitting -87, and I think that's more in line with my experience as well. All right, people, I just want to go through, we're out of time. I just want to thank all those that left the questions. We have several super chats. Vincent, thank you for the super chat. I know that Rob sent one in as well. So Rob, thank you for that. Great review of the Godox. Excuse me, I need to say that correctly. For those that are into light as well, video lighting, we did have a review of a Godox light today. A lot of people have been asking questions about that light in relation to the aperture lights, and my impression is that it's really good on some fronts and it's not so awesome on other fronts. So just something to consider there. Jason, thank you for the super chat there. Thanks for hosting and everyone for taking your part and sharing advice. One thing we're going to do, looking into the future, now that I've got sorted out that multi-platform live streaming with the StreamYard is one option. There's another option that somebody sent me some information about that we can check. We may be bringing on some guests here to help with the live streams here on Sunday. So stand by. Well, hopefully some production mixers and some other people that can help us out here. We can all learn from. Greg, thank you so much for the super chat. Getting back to calibrating audio workstation, I've heard calibrating listening station to 85 SPL, minus 20 dB. C-weighted white noise, not sure if that is minus 20 dB normalized, minus 20 dB RMS, minus 20 LUFS. All were too loud for me. Yeah, and I agree. That my only guess is that's something that's done in the theaters, and that just seems really loud to me as well. So I'm with you. Maybe it's us old guys our hearing is getting rough though. So Terrence, thank you also for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And thanks everyone for joining. We'll be back with you next week. Also keep an eye out. Again, Tuesday we'll have a video that I think will be of interest, especially to those of you that do location sound and production sound with, the more pro level gear. And then we may also be looking for some additional help on the live streams here to get some more expertise in here. My expertise is very limited, so having someone else come in would be really helpful. And then also watch for the Zoom F6 course, possibly hosting it later this week if everything goes well. So get out there and make some great sound, everybody. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you again soon.